Tonight we start somewhere a little shadowier. An age of sickness, harsh penalties, and watery stew. We're settling into what daily life truly felt like in the Middle Ages. Set aside the gleaming castles and noble knights that the movies handed you. In reality, you'd be lucky to survive even one day. So before you settle in, feel free to gently tap that follow button, but only if these quiet stories truly bring you comfort. And if you'd like, leave a whisper below about where you're resting your head tonight and the hour where you are. It's lovely to imagine all of you drifting off from every corner of the globe. Now, lower the lights, perhaps switch on a fan for that soft, steady hum, and let's slip into tonight's story side by side. Congratulations, you've just stirred awake in the year 1325. The good news, you're breathing. The bad news, so are the fleas. Your bed is a crumbling straw mattress packed with insects and hay that smells like a barn floor, because it was a barn floor only 3 months back. No memory foam, no pillows, certainly no fine cotton sheets. Just a wool blanket unwashed since last winter, now heavy as a small calf from layers of grime. You crack your eyes open as a distant church bell rings out. It's the medieval alarm clock, only louder and somehow even less forgiving. Your home is a one-room wooden hut, no windows, with a cozy open layout where your family, your animals, and the resident bugs all live together. The smell? Well, it's a fragrant chorus. A gentle mix of stale beer, sweat, goat, and something you hope isn't mold, though deep down you suspect it is. Scented candles don't exist yet, and even if they did, they'd just puddle on your dirt floor. You try to stretch and instantly regret it, because the air bites cold and every joint protests. You're 22, which by medieval reckoning is fairly middle-aged. Your back creaks like an old wooden door, and your knees rattle like a sack of stones shaken by a baffled peasant. Rising from bed is a gamble. The floor is either soaked from last night's rain leaking through the thatch, or crusted with something the neighbour's chicken left behind. Either way, your bare feet are now part of the ecosystem. Oh, and privacy. What's that? Your whole family, plus maybe a stray cousin who simply never left, are stirring awake beside you. No bedroom, no curtains, no time to yourself, just shared everything. Welcome to morning in medieval Europe, where you're never quite alone, because parasites, rodents, and 8 other people are always near. And this is merely how the day begins. It only slides downhill from here. So, you've hauled yourself out of your medieval pile of straw and misery. Well done. Now nature calls. And it isn't asking kindly. It's shrieking. Here's where you start aching for a modern bathroom. There's no toilet, no seat, no paper, no flush, not even a grumpy plunger sulking in the corner. In the 14th century, relieving yourself is an adventure, a social trial, and often a modest public event. If you're a peasant, your bathroom is probably a wooden bucket out back, already brimming because Uncle Woolstan had a rough night after some bad turnips. The stench is biblical. You hold your breath, finish the deed, and then here's the twist. You fling it into the street. Yes, the street. You're meant to holler something like gardyloo before tipping it out the window. That's old French for watch out below, though honestly, no one ever ducks quickly enough. Streets in medieval towns are open sewers, a lovely river of human waste, animal droppings, and mystery fluids you'd rather not study. If you happen to live in a town with public latrines, congratulations. You sit shoulder to shoulder with strangers in an outhouse where privacy is a fantasy and fresh air is a cruel joke. You might chat a little, but try not to inhale too deeply. Toilet paper, never heard of it. Most people wipe with straw, leaves, rags, moss, or for a touch of luxury, a scrap of wool. Sometimes nothing at all, which may explain why handshakes hadn't caught on yet. And in a castle, surely it's nicer, right? Sort of. You might have a garderobe, a hole in the wall that drops your waist straight into the moat. Clever, except your enemies know it too. And yes, attackers sometimes crawled up through that very chute. Talk about coming in through the back door. So whether you're a farmer or a baron, medieval toileting is a ritual of humiliation. It's cold, it's public, it's dangerous, and it's never anything but vile. One slip on a wet stone path, and you're face first in humanity's leftovers. And you still haven't brushed your teeth, but we'll reach that soon. You survived the toilet. You've earned a reward, surely. Maybe a pleasant breakfast. Something warm, tasty, soothing. Nothing here soothes. Breakfast, if it deserves the name, is a bleak affair. No eggs. Benedict, no coffee machines coughing to life, and definitely no avocado toast. You sit or crouch by the fire before a wooden bowl of something that looks scraped from a muddy boot. Welcome to your daily helping of pottage. Pottage is a thick, gluey stew of whatever you can scrounge. Grains, root vegetables, maybe a few beans if luck favours you. It's been simmering in the same pot for days, sometimes weeks, with fresh ingredients simply piled on the old. It's less a recipe than an ongoing edible experiment. Alongside it, a hunk of bread hard enough to turn aside arrows. It's made from coarse rye or barley flour, often padded out with sawdust, ground acorns, or other inventive fillers, because wheat is a rich man's daydream. This loaf is no friend of yours. You don't slice it. You bargain with it. Drinks? You're not sipping orange juice or an oat milk latte. You're drinking beer. Yes, beer. At 6 in the morning. Why? Because the water swarms with parasites and filth. So you open your day with weak ale, low in alcohol, high in survivability. The children drink it too. No one's pleased about it, but at least it won't kill you on the spot. Fancy some meat or cheese? Most peasants taste meat just a few times a year. As for fresh fruit, only in season and not yet turned to wine, and don't even imagine spices unless you're royalty. A pinch of pepper costs more than a month's wages. Salt is precious enough to be locked away. So you chew your gritty bread, swallow your medieval beer, and try not to dwell on the rat that may have sampled your porridge overnight. Breakfast doesn't fuel you, it merely happens to you. And now that you're properly underfed, it's time to work as though your life depends on it, because it does. So, you've choked down your sad medieval breakfast, and now it's time to get dressed. Not that it'll help much. Your wardrobe holds exactly one outfit. 1. It's a rough wool tunic or a linen shift you've worn every single day for months, possibly years. Seasonal fashion doesn't exist. There's only wear this until it falls apart or gives you a fungal infection. Underwear optional. If you're fortunate, perhaps a linen undershirt sits against your skin. If not, then it's bare flesh beneath layers of itchy, sweat-soaked wool, all carefully sewn by someone who likely never grasped what a proper seam should resemble. There's no washing machine either, no soap, and certainly no dry cleaner anywhere nearby. So your garments are stained, rigid, and perfumed like a compost heap left to ripen inside a pigsty, and even if cleaning them appealed to you, it isn't simple. You carry water up from a river or warm it over flames, scour your tunic on a board using ashes or lye, then drape it in sunshine, which appears roughly 3 days a year. And don't even mention shoes. If you have a pair, they're untreated leather, barely held together, offering about as much arch support as a banana peel. Most peasants simply walk barefoot through mud, through dung, through medieval hazards like sharp stones and disease-filled puddles. All of this adds up to one truth. Your skin despises you. The itching never stops. Fleas, lice and bedbugs dwell rent-free across your body. Everyone hosts them. Nobles, scratchy monks, fidgeting children, walking colonies of insects. Nobody is spared. You'll be scratching an armpit with a wooden spoon while chatting with the village priest, and not a single soul will blink. Your skin is raw from constant chafing. Your scalp a war zone of bites. And if a rash appears, well, tough luck. There's no dermatologist, no hydrocortisone, no one to suggest it's likely scabies. You just go on enduring it. And should you be fortunate enough to dodge an infection, wonderful. That rash will simply tag along for the next 6 months, like an unwelcome medieval companion. Now that you're clothed in misery and wrapped in discomfort, it's time to step outside and begin working yourself to death. Now that you're fully dressed in itches and damp wool, it's time to flash a morning grin. Except you won't. Because in the Middle Ages, smiling is a risky business. Not emotionally, dentally. There's no toothbrush, no toothpaste, no mouthwash, no floss. The notion of oral hygiene is roughly as fashionable as bathing, which is to say, hardly at all. Some folks might gnaw a twig or rinse with wine or vinegar, but mostly your teeth are left to fend for themselves, and they aren't faring well. By the time you reach your mid-20s, your smile resembles something dragged out of a haunted crypt. Cavities run wild. Gums are swollen. And those aren't merely food stains on your teeth. That's decay. You carry more rot in your mouth than a medieval root merchant. Sugar, while not yet everywhere, is growing more common among the wealthy. Imported at huge expense, mostly used in little cakes or to flaunt riches. If you're a noble, congratulations. You get to rot your teeth quicker than the peasants do. If you're poor, you'll do it gradually, with fermented bread, gritty porridge, and years of hard chewing. Toothaches, get accustomed to them. They're like medieval weather, forever lurking in the background. The sort of pain that makes you ponder praying, drinking, or yanking the tooth out yourself with pliers. And that's no joke. That was the genuine treatment. Dentists didn't really exist, but bar the surgeons did. Yes. The same man trimming your hair also pulls your molars by candlelight with an iron hook and zero anesthesia. Infected tooth. Hope you enjoy fevers. Because without antibiotics, it can easily slide into sepsis and kill you from a toothache. That's right. The very thing that sends us to a pharmacy today could be your funeral in the 1300s. And there's no comfort on the social front either. Kissing. Good luck. Halitosis, bad breath, is everywhere. If you're single, you aren't judged by your smile. You're judged by your land and your livestock. In short, Your mouth is a battlefield, and it's losing the war. Now that your teeth are throbbing, let's head outdoors. Because your real job, the one that will break your back, is only just beginning. Time to head to work. Except there's no office, no desk, no coffee break, and no hope of promotion. Your job, if you're like 90% of the population, is simple. Don't die while toiling for someone else's comfort. You're a peasant. That means you work land belonging to a lord who probably can't recall your name. You rise with the sun and quit only when it slips behind the trees. Your tools, a wooden hoe, a rusty sickle, and whatever bones remain intact in your body. There's no weekend, there's no clocking out. There's only sunrise to sunset 6 days a week. Sunday is free, but only if you aren't harvesting, fending off raiders, or praying desperately for your infected toe to stop turning black. The labor is brutal. Fields are ploughed by hand or with oxen, if you're rich enough to own one. You dig ditches, sow seeds, pull weeds and haul water until your spine starts to resemble the letter S. Nobody cares if you're weary. Nobody's asking about your mental health. If you're a woman, surprise. You don't just work the fields, you also mind the children. Clean, cook, spin wool, feed the animals, and pretend your husband's lice infestation isn't slowly creeping toward your side of the bed. Children. They start pitching in around age 5. No school, no toys, just a tiny wooden rake and a dream of someday not dying of the flu. And if you're one of the few who isn't a farmer, perhaps a blacksmith, a tanner or a cooper, wonderful. You still work with fire, chemicals or animal guts all day in poorly ventilated sheds. The pay, basically survival. The perks, occasional bleeding, break a bone, tough luck. Catch a fever, drink some warm beer and carry on. You can't afford to stop, not even for one day, because if you don't work, you don't eat. And if you don't eat, well, medieval Europe has a remedy for that. It's called being replaced. So you grip your shovel, ignore the blisters, and keep digging. Because in the Middle Ages, your job isn't a career. It's a slow-motion endurance test. Now that your back is ablaze from laboring in the fields, let's talk about the weather. Because in the Middle Ages, temperature is less about seasons and more about steady punishment from the sky. Let's begin with winter. The fire in the hearth, lovely in theory, but you don't have enough firewood to keep it burning because wood is costly and gathering it from the forest is sometimes illegal. Yes, you can be executed for picking up the wrong stick from the wrong forest. You bundle into your one damp wool tunic, huddle beside the dying embers, and still wake with your nose frozen, your feet permanently cold, often damp. Your fingers so stiff they feel like tiny medieval popsicles. Frostbite isn't diagnosed, it's simply called bad luck. Now, jump ahead to summer. Sounds better, right? Wrong. In summer, your home becomes a clay oven. There's no fan, no cross breeze, and absolutely no deodorant. You sweat through your layers, but you can't shed them because bearing too much skin is scandalous and also invites sunburn, insect bites, and social judgment. The flies are out in full force. drawn to your unwashed body and the smell of last week's goat stew still fermenting in the corner. Mosquitoes whine beside your ear as you try to rest. That is, if you can drift off at all over the shouting neighbours and the wailing infants. Out in the fields, the sun cooks you. There is no sunscreen, no hat, unless you wove one from straw like some hopeless scarecrow. And the cruelest part is that you must keep working anyway. Heat stroke is simply called having a bad spell. So either you are trembling in your hut, wondering whether your toes will survive until spring, or you are soaking through your only socks while your thighs rub raw. And the one constant, whatever the season, is that your clothes still scratch, your food is still awful, and another chore still waits. Welcome to Climate Control, Medieval Edition. There isn't any. Thirsty? Want to clean up? Hoping to splash a little water on your face and shake off this clammy fever of a life? No such luck. In medieval times, water is not on your side. It is quietly plotting your death. Take drinking. The stream nearby looks fresh, babbling and clear, like a scene from a fantasy film. But here is the catch. It isn't. Just upstream, somebody emptied a chamber pot into it. And if not that, a dead pig is likely rotting in the current. Parasites, bacteria, and the whole microbial army of medieval Europe wait in every mouthful. That is why people drank beer. Yes, beer, even the children. But before you picture medieval kids doing keg stands, know that this was small beer, faint in alcohol, mighty in survival. Brewing meant boiling the water so it beat whatever ran through the town ditch. Wine was another choice, if you were wealthy enough and untroubled by being useless before noon. What about washing? Surely water served to clean. In theory, yes. In practice, never. You see, people back then believed bathing opened your pores and let sickness slip inside. That is right. Scrubbing yourself was thought to be a medical hazard. You were supposedly cleaner if you never stripped away the protective crust of grime caked on your skin. Public bathhouses did exist, but they soon earned reputations as dens of gossip, scandal, and the occasional medieval extracurricular. So, of course, the church stepped in and closed many of them. And even if you did fancy a bath, it was a whole ordeal. You had to haul water from the well, boil it over a fire, fill a leaky wooden tub, and then pray no one in the house had used it first, or worse, would use it after. And rainwater pooled in open barrels where birds drop, insects breed, and moss flourishes. Sounds refreshing, doesn't it? So whether it is bound for your mouth, your body, or your crops, water in the Middle Ages is less a source of life and more a roll of the dice. One bad swallow, and you spend your last days sweating in a straw bed, gripping your belly and reconsidering every choice you ever made. Next time you sip from the tap, lift a glass to our ancestors. They never had the luxury of hydration without hazard, so you drank the water. Or maybe you didn't. Maybe you just stubbed your toe on a rock shaped like disappointment. Either way, you are ill. You need help. You need a doctor. Whatever ails you, a cough, a rash, a broken bone, or the creeping plague, comes down to your humours falling out of balance. The four humours were blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. By medieval science, your health rests on keeping them even, like some kind of internal soup. Running a fever. Too much blood. The solution? Bloodletting. Clearly an excess of black bile. The remedy? Laxatives. Maybe a warm herbal purge, or just prayers and a cold compress while everyone avoids your gaze and starts carving your coffin. Now, if you break a bone or take a nasty wound, you are in genuine trouble. There is no anesthesia unless you count fainting from the pain. Surgery is done with knives that haven't been cleaned since the Crusades. Tools are heated over flame, not to sterilize them, but because they simply look more frightening that way. Antibiotics are centuries off. Germ theory isn't a thing yet. They think illness comes from foul air or from God being irritated by your moral lapses. Got a stomachache? Must be your sinful thoughts. Hope you enjoy confessing while vomiting. If you take a turn for the worse, you will be treated with more leeches, perhaps some crushed beetles, and a priest at your bedside reading last rites just in case. By now they are readying you for the cure called death. And if somehow you pull through, everyone simply assumes God took pity on you. The doctor claims full credit, and the leech earns a promotion. So yes, in the Middle Ages, medicine is less about healing and more about surviving the cure. After a long day of labour, lice and leeches, it is finally time to eat. You shuffle back to your hut, stomach rumbling, ready for the one pleasure life still allows, a warm meal. Bad news. Your supper is probably trying to kill you. Begin with the basics. Food preservation barely exists. There is no fridge, no freezer, only salt, smoke, or the hope that winter air keeps things from turning. Your meat, if you are lucky enough to have any, has hung for days, swarmed by flies, steeped in dubious brine, and maybe sampled by a rat or two. Bread is the foundation of the medieval diet. But even that is not safe. In lean harvest years, desperate peasants pad it out with bark, sawdust, or even clay to stretch it further. And in rice season there is a bonus. Ergot, a fungus that brings on convulsions, hallucinations, and sometimes death. It is like eating bread spiked with LSD and tetanus. Vegetables, only when they are in season. And you know what is always in season? Turnips. So very many turnips. Boiled, mashed, or bobbing in pottage, which, if you recall from chapter 3, is basically a hot swamp of mystery ingredients that has been simmering since your great-grandfather's funeral. Fruit might turn up in autumn, but it spoils fast, and sugar is scarce, costly, and hoarded by the rich to flaunt their blackened teeth. Dairy is another gamble. Fresh milk sours within hours. Butter and cheese last longer, but they teem with bacteria. People eat them regardless, because honestly it is that, or gnaw on your boot leather. And let us talk seasoning. Spices like pepper, cinnamon, or nutmeg are worth more than gold. For the ordinary peasant, flavour comes from onions, salt if you are lucky, and suffering. Most meals taste like wet burlap dusted with sorrow. But food is not only a health risk, it is a political one. Game animals belong to the Lord, not to you. Caught poaching a rabbit, and you could be fined, jailed, or even executed. That is right. Your dinner could see you hanged. So as you settle down to your grey stew by the flickering firelight, remember that every bite is a gamble, but you eat anyway. You might think the day is drawing to a close, but do not get too comfortable, because God is watching. So is the parson, and so is Agnes next door, who will gladly report you the moment you skip a service. In medieval Europe, faith isn't merely one piece of life, it is the whole of it. The church owns your calendar, your laws, your schooling, your reading, your birth, your wedding, your death, and every moment between. Picture it as your spiritual landlord, and your rent is forever overdue. Each day is shaped by the prayer bells. Not as a gentle reminder, but because skipping prayer is a sin. Forget to bow. Sin. Eat meat on a Friday. Sin. Dream about your neighbour's wife just once. Double sin. And yes, hell is utterly real, vividly so. Priests paint it in loving detail. Rivers of fire, lakes of boiling blood, demons clutching pitchforks, and endless screaming. If the plague doesn't frighten you, eternal damnation surely will. You can't read scripture on your own, since it's set down in Latin, a tongue saved for monks, clergy, and the rare noble boy too fine for the mud. You depend on the church to explain it all. So if the priest claims your crops failed because your prayers were weak, well, kneel a little harder. Tithes, a tenth of all you have, are required. Grow wheat, you hand over wheat. Keep chickens, you hand over eggs. Own nothing, congratulations. You're spiritually bankrupt and financially ruined. Holidays, they're holy days. Dozens of them. And while they pause your labour, they aren't for fun. Instead, you attend Mass, fast, confess your sins, and remind yourself that joy is a perilous luxury. Doubting the church is dangerous. Heretics burn, witches drown, blasphemers are flogged, and skeptics are swiftly corrected. So you simply perform. You chant. You bow. You pray that your soul, having survived this dirt-caked life, might at last reach paradise, provided the priest is fond of you. Because in the Middle Ages, God may be merciful, but the church far less so. If you thought the medieval peasant had it hard, try living it as a woman. All the filth, hunger, and dread, plus childbirth, obedience, and being unseen. In the Middle Ages, womanhood is like playing on hard mode with no health potions and no reset button. From the cradle, a girl's road is more or less fixed. Marry young, bear children, serve your husband, die worn out. Education, unlikely. Unless you're noble, born and placed in a convent, you're learning halts about the time you master churning butter and mending a tunic. Marriage comes early. Truly early. Being promised at 12 and carrying a child by 14 is hardly strange. It isn't about love. It's about land, livestock, and alliances. Your view isn't wanted. Once wed, you're essentially your husband's property. Your task is to bear heirs, feed the household, keep things running, and stay quiet. Because grumbling might earn you the name of nag, or worse, witch. That title arrives with a free drowning or burning, whichever the locals prefer. Childbirth is a deadly gamble. No prenatal care, no clean tools, no anesthesia. Midwives try their hardest, yet even small complications can kill the mother, the child, or both. Some women endure 10 pregnancies. Many don't endure. But never fear, once the baby arrives, your workload grows. Now there's a wailing infant in a lice-ridden hut, and you're meant to nurse, cook, clean, and still labour in the fields. You get no rest. You are the rest for everyone else. Unmarried, you're suspicious. Widowed, vulnerable. Outspoken, dangerous. Women who refused to fit in were often charged with witchcraft, especially if they knew herbs, had a bold spirit, or simply glanced at someone oddly on a wet Tuesday. Even within the church, your place is narrow. Nuns live by harsh rules. No speaking without leave, no freedom to move about, and your spiritual value always set below a man's. In short, a woman in the Middle Ages is meant to bear up, obey, reproduce, and suffer quietly, ideally with a smile. Because even in an age of shared misery, women were somehow asked to suffer extra. So far, you've fought filth, hunger, injustice, and possibly a goat. But just when your day seems as bad as it gets, here comes violence. Loud, bloody, and often perfectly acceptable by medieval standards. Let's be plain, the Middle Ages were not calm. Law and order mostly meant hoping the local lord isn't in a foul mood. Violence is everywhere, in the home, in the streets, on the battlefield, in church quarrels, and now and then in the queue at the shared bread oven. Crime is common, punishment is brutal, and justice is more theatre than safeguard. Steal a loaf, you might lose a hand. Accused of lying, your tongue could be pierced. Gossip too freely, meet the scold's bridle, a metal mask buckled to your head with a bar in your mouth. For correction, naturally. Suppose you're charged with something grave, heresy, theft, witchcraft. How do you prove yourself innocent? By being tortured, of course. Welcome to trial by ordeal. One form, you plunge your hand into boiling water to fetch a stone. If it heals cleanly within 3 days, you're innocent. If not, you're guilty. Another choice, you're thrown into a river. Sink, and you're innocent, and probably dead. Float, and you're guilty and punished anyway. It's like a medieval game show where the prize is survival and the host wants you to lose. And if you're sentenced to die, that's a public affair. Executions happen before cheering crowds. Hangings, beheadings, burnings. Sometimes folk bring snacks. It's the medieval version of cable TV. Domestic violence, wholly normal. Husbands were permitted, even expected, to discipline their wives and children. Street brawls every day. You could be beaten merely for eyeing a noble's horse the wrong way. And war, always smouldering. Local feuds, land disputes, religious crusades. Someone's forever marching off to stab someone else in the name of honor, God, or boredom. Violence isn't a collapse of society in the Middle Ages. It is society. Everyone lives knowing that life is fragile, justice is random, and your neighbour might split your skull over a pig. So tread softly, keep your eyes lowered, and never trust anyone holding a club. By now, You've survived the lice, the leeches, the laundryless squalor, and the looming threat of public disembowelment. But now comes the final chapter of most medieval lives, an early and graceless death. If you're still breathing past 40, you're practically a celebrity. People might even call you the Old One, which is less a nickname and more a statistical miracle. Let's break it down. Average life expectancy hovers around 30 to 40 years, but that figure is pulled down hard by infant mortality. Nearly half of all children died before reaching 5. Disease, malnutrition, or a single harsh winter was enough. No vaccines, no antibiotics, no hope. If you made it through childhood, you entered adulthood already worn out. Work began the moment you could stand upright, and by 25 your joints groaned like a monastery door. You might be short several teeth, a finger, and most of your original optimism. Women faced an especially deadly trial, childbirth. It was among the leading causes of death for medieval women. No pain relief, no medical aid, just prayer, hot water, and someone holding your hand while you bled out on a straw-stuffed cot. For men, the threat simply wore a different face, but they were no less constant. A slip behind the plough, a small cut that festered, a drunken quarrel with the man next door, a holy war that turned to ruin. Even a stroll to market could end badly if you met a restless robber or a furious taxman. Death might also arrive softly through the plague, which emptied whole cities in a night, or through famine, which dragged on for seasons and quietly hollowed out villages, or through sheer misfortune, like swallowing rotten grain and passing your last hours raving at the walls. And funerals were a privilege. Bodies went into the ground fast to keep sickness at bay. No embalming, no fine coffins, only a pit, a few mumbled prayers, and a thin heap of soil, provided the churchyard still had room. So yes, in the medieval age, life was harsh, brief, and forever besieged by death in its plainest forms. You never retired. You simply stopped turning up. And speaking of endings, let us drift into your closing chapter. The medieval dream fades. So, how has your day gone? You woke in grime, emptied yourself into a pail, cleaned your teeth with pure hope, nearly fainted from hunger, toiled until your back begged for relief, itched beneath rough wool, prayed away the plague, and barely escaped a hanging for keeping a squirrel. Welcome to one ordinary day in medieval Europe. Still longing to be a knight? Reconsider. That dressed-up picture of the Middle Ages, dashing swordsmen, graceful ladies in towers, glorious battles and feasts in candlelit halls, is a fancy buffed smooth by fairy tales and fantasy novels. The real medieval world was grimy, cruel, and deeply unjust. Rank decided everything. Born poor, you stayed poor. Born rich, well done, your odds of living improved, though you were still one bad bowl of soup from dysentery and a quick grave. Even nobles were not spared the gloom. Castles were chilly stone iceboxes, thick with fleas, smoke, and marriages arranged for power. Yes, you had a fur cloak and a cup of wine, but also even odds of dying in a brawl or from an infected splinter. Hardly luxury. The simpler times were never simple. They were merciless. Everything took longer, everything ached more. Everything from childbirth to chewing carried a price. Life meant survival, not ease. And if you stole a still moment to think, to dream, to picture something finer, there was little you could do with it. No climbing the ladder, no modern medicine, no internet to ask what this odd rash might be. You lived, suffered, laboured, and died within 10 miles of your birthplace. Yet here is the strangest part. Through all of it, people still laughed, sang, told tales, fell in love, and found meaning. Not because life was kind, but because humans are stubborn that way. Even in the bleakest chapters, they kept room for light. So tonight, as you sink into your clean bed with indoor plumbing, antibiotics, and warm air, perhaps whisper a quiet thanks to the modern world, and to your ancestors who battled rats, famine, and feudalism, so you would not have to. Long before she was Catherine the Great, Empress of all Russia, champion of reform and emblem of ambition, she was only Sophie. Born Sophie Friederike Augusta von Anhalt-Zerbst in 1729, she came from a fairly minor German princely line. Her small duchy in Pomerania held little real power. But she herself carried something no title could grant: a razor-keen mind, untiring charm, and a quiet, smouldering hunger for greatness. Her childhood was strict. Her mother, Johanna, was cold and calculating, no warm or tender presence, but a social climber fixed on status. Sophie's father, a Prussian officer, was more remote than stern. Early on, Sophie learned to tread the thin line between obedience and cunning. She read hungrily, spoke several languages, and learned to study a room before she spoke in it, skills that would soon become survival tools in one of Europe's cruelest courts. When the Russian Empress Elizabeth Petrovna began hunting for a wife for her heir, Grand Duke Peter, she looked past Russia's borders. Peter was himself of German blood, and Elizabeth believed a foreign bride, malleable and grateful, would prove easier to manage. Sophie suited the part perfectly. Noble lineage, a Lutheran faith she would be made to give up, and a name for both grace and modesty. At only 14, Sophie was called to Russia. She reached the freezing capital of St. Petersburg in 1744, dressed in thin German cloth and a diplomat's smile. Her mother nudged her forward like a chess piece. Sophie, though, was playing her own game. To win acceptance in Russian society, she converted to Orthodoxy and took the name Yekaterina, Catherine. The ceremony was public, symbolic, and life-changing. She was not merely swapping religions. She was burning the bridge behind her, walking into a foreign empire with no road back. No one watching that quiet teenage girl in her fur-trimmed coat could have foreseen what lay ahead. Betrayal, revolution, enlightenment, and empire. But from the moment Sophie set foot in the Russian court, she stopped being a pawn and began plotting how to become a queen. Catherine's marriage to Grand Duke Peter was meant to fasten her place in Russian royalty, but from the start it felt more like a cage than a crown. Peter, heir to the Russian throne, was no dashing prince from a storybook. Awkward, childish, and absorbed in toy soldiers, he cared far more for staging war games in his rooms than for ruling an empire or showing tenderness to his new wife. Some accounts even claim he refused to consummate the marriage for years. He worshipped Frederick the Great of Prussia and resented the Russian court that had taken him in. Catherine, by contrast, embraced Russia with fierce resolve. She learned the language, studied its history, and memorized Orthodox rites. She wished to belong. Peter wished to flee. This mismatch was not merely emotional, it was political. The Russian court was a nest of vipers, all gossip, paranoia, and ruthless power games. Empress Elizabeth still ruled with total authority, but her health was failing. Everyone sensed a transition coming, and everyone had an agenda. Catherine was watched without pause. Her letters were read, her friendships tracked, her every move examined. She could not trust her husband, her mother, who still whispered in her ear for foreign interests, or even her servants. In this world, alliances could curdle into accusations overnight. But Catherine was no fool. She quietly learned the court's games, growing allies in the shadows. She charmed military officers, befriended scholars, and earned a name for dignity and restraint, a sharp contrast to her husband's childish fits and open scorn for Russian custom. While others saw only a young consort, she was shaping a vision, not just for herself, but for Russia, a land of strength, learning, and reason. But there was one trouble. The longer Peter lived, the longer Catherine stayed in limbo, a powerless wife to a man unfit to rule. So she waited, watched, and planned. She knew the Russian throne would not be inherited. It would have to be taken. In 1762, after nearly 2 decades of waiting, watching, and quiet manoeuvring, Catherine saw her moment and seized it with breathtaking precision. Empress Elizabeth had died, and Peter, now Peter III, was finally Tsar. But his rule started to come apart almost at once. Within only a handful of months, Peter had angered the church, slighted the nobles, insulted the army, and heaped praise on Prussia, Russia's foe. He undid important policies, shamed the clergy, and spoke freely of casting Catherine aside to wed his mistress. The court, already uneasy with his unpredictable manner, grew distant. The army, full of generals devoted to Catherine, muttered in the hallways. Even everyday Russians, faithful and proud of their land, viewed Peter as a foreign puppet who scorned their customs. Catherine, watching it all take shape, made her move. In July of that very year, while Peter was away at his summer palace, Catherine set in motion a bloodless coup. Backed by leading military officers, among them her lover Gregory Orlov and his powerful brothers, she rode through St. Petersburg in full ceremony, was declared Empress Catherine II, and gained the loyalty of the mighty Imperial Guard. Peter, taken by surprise and without allies, gave himself up within days. He was placed in custody and soon after found dead under murky circumstances. The official account named it a hemorrhoidal colic. The truth was murder. Catherine was now empress. Not through birth, not through marriage, but through will, cleverness, and nerve. It had never been done. A foreign-born woman with no rightful claim had seized the Russian throne without one battle. Yet her true test was only starting. She had to turn that daring seizure of power into something lasting. Would Russia welcome her? Would the nobles honor her? Could she keep the empire whole without meeting the same end as her husband? Catherine knew that power won through scheming could slip away just as fast. She needed to lead not as a plotter, but as a visionary. And so began her shift from cautious conspirator to reforming empress. One who would redraw borders, take up the Enlightenment, and reshape what it meant to be a woman holding power. With the crown in hand, Catherine could have simply leaned on her authority. But she did not. She had something larger in view than merely occupying a throne. She wished to transform Russia, and not only in war or politics, but in the mind. Where Peter had admired Frederick the Great and toy soldiers, Catherine looked up to Voltaire, Diderot, and the daring thinkers of the age. She trusted in reason, progress, learning, and the idea of a monarch as a servant of the people, even as she herself ruled with absolute command. Catherine did not merely read Enlightenment thought, she lived it. She wrote to Voltaire directly for more than 15 years, flattering him while defending her own autocracy. She brought Diderot to her court and even bought his whole library to support him with money. Behind closed doors, she studied legal texts, argued over reforms, and shaped policies to modernize the empire. Her early reign was full of efforts to set down Russian law. She created the Legislative Commission in 1767, a sweeping project meant to rewrite the entire legal code of Russia. Catherine's own nakaz, or instruction, was a political manifesto in disguise, one that spoke of equality before the law, the dangers of torture, and the duty of rulers to serve the common good. For an empress in 18th century Russia, it was radical. But Enlightenment ideals had to survive the realities of Russia. A vast, feudal, deeply traditional land ruled by nobles who liked their serfs exactly where they were, beneath them. Catherine understood this. While she championed reform, she moved with care. She did away with certain forms of torture, widened access to secular learning, and built schools and libraries. Yet she also confirmed the nobles' hold over their serfs to keep them loyal. This was Catherine's balancing act. A philosopher queen in public, a practical empress in private. She walked a tightrope between ideas and survival, between the bright salons of Paris and the rough politics of Moscow. Her vision for Russia was bold, but always measured. In many ways, Catherine was not trying to make Russia European. She was trying to make Russia modern on her own terms. And that meant reform, yes, but with an iron hand inside a glove. Catherine was not satisfied with reforming Russia from within. She wanted to grow it outward, to make it an empire worthy of fear, admiration, and respect. Where Peter the Great had opened a window to the west, Catherine aimed to tear down the walls. Under her command, Russia's borders reached farther than ever before. She fought wars not only to guard her crown, but to redraw the map of Europe. One of her most important campaigns was against the Ottoman Empire. These wars, fought in waves through the 1760s and 1770s, were not only about land, they were about influence. Catherine saw herself as the liberator of Orthodox Christians living under Muslim rule, and as the rightful guardian of Eastern Europe. Under generals like Alexander Suvorov and Gregory Potemkin, Russia took key regions including Crimea, the northern shore of the Black Sea, and access to warm water ports, something Russian Tsars had longed for over generations. These victories were not only military, they were symbolic. With each conquest, Catherine sent a message. Russia was no longer the distant backward cousin of Europe, it was a continental power. She also turned her eyes westward. Through a series of deals and diplomatic moves, Catherine took part in the partitions of Poland, carving up the failing Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth alongside Austria and Prussia. By the close of the Third Partition in 1795, Poland was wiped from the map, and Russia claimed vast new lands and millions of new subjects. But Catherine did not only conquer with armies, she also colonized with ideas. New cities rose, trade routes spread. German settlers were invited to work Russian farmland. The empire grew into a mosaic from the icy Baltic to the sun-warmed shores of the Black Sea. And through all of it, Catherine stayed the central force, reading reports, giving orders, and personally watching over the shape of her growing empire. Critics would call her power-hungry, even imperialistic. But to Catherine, expansion was not ambition. It was destiny. A great ruler, she believed, was measured not only by ideas, but by borders. She did not simply want to rule Russia. She wanted to remake it as a civilized empire, feared by its enemies, respected by its peers, and loyal to her alone. For all her brilliance and power, Catherine the Great was just as known for what happened behind palace doors. And no, not all of it was whispered in libraries. Catherine's private life became one of the most talked about parts of her reign. She had lovers, not just one or two, but a carefully chosen parade of them, many far younger, often handsome, and sometimes politically powerful. She did not hide them. In fact, she often rewarded them with titles, estates, and pensions if they behaved well. If not, they were quietly let go, sometimes with a polite thank you and a promotion. Among the most important of these lovers was Gregory Potemkin, a man as brilliant as he was bold. Their bond blurred the lines between romance, politics, and partnership. Some historians believe they may have even married in secret. Together, they shaped military campaigns, colonization projects, and the transformation of southern Russia. Potemkin was not just a lover, he was her co-ruler in many ways. Still, Europe could not look past the scandal. Gossip swirled. Satirical pamphlets painted her as lustful, insatiable, even unhinged. And after her death, the rumours only grew worse. The most infamous being the completely false and grotesque tale involving a horse, spread by her enemies to stain her legacy. But why the obsession? Simple. Catherine was a woman who held power without apology. And in a world where female rulers were expected to be either saintly virgins or tragic figures, she refused to play the role. She lived, she loved, and she governed entirely on her own terms, and that is precisely what made her so dangerous. Curiously, though her detractors cast her as immoral, Catherine herself thought deeply about love and desire. She held that pleasure was a natural thread of life, and that private bonds need not endanger public duty. She kept feeling apart from rule, something few male sovereigns ever managed. In truth, her attachments were calculated. She gathered around her men who were loyal, gifted, and politically valuable, and when their usefulness ran out, she released them, usually with a smile and a comfortable pension. Catherine's romances never softened her grip. They were woven into her plan, a marriage of passion and power that left her unforgettable, envied and feared. For all her charm and command, Catherine's reign held real danger. And in 1773 that danger arrived as a bearded Cossack named Yemelyan Pugachev. He was no common rebel. Pugachev declared that he was none other than Peter III, Catherine's late husband. By his account, he had survived the coup and now came back to reclaim his crown from the German pretender. It was nonsense. Peter was long dead. Yet to Russia's weary and downtrodden poor, the claim needn't be true. It only had to offer hope. Pugachev promised freedom, an end to serfdom, lighter taxes, and land for ordinary people. His words kindled a blaze across the Volga region, especially among Cossack peasants and old believers. In an age when the chasm between noble and serf had grown brutally wide, his promises rang like deliverance. The Pugachev rebellion grew into the largest peasant uprising in Russian history. Towns were seized, fortresses fell, nobles were killed. For one frightening stretch, it seemed the empire itself might split apart. Catherine was rattled. This was no foreign war to be won with cavalry and treaties. This was a revolt from within her own people, rising against the very order she upheld. But Catherine did not panic. She acted. She sent trained military forces to crush the rising without mercy. Pugachev's army was beaten in 1774. He was taken, paraded in an iron cage, and at last beheaded in Moscow, a public warning to any who might follow. Afterward, Catherine tightened her hold on order and control. Her hopes of freeing the serfs quietly slipped into silence. The revolt had shown her the limits of enlightenment in a land still bound by feudalism. She now leaned harder on the nobility, who traded loyalty for total mastery over their serfs. This was a turning point. The empress who once quoted Voltaire now placed stability above philosophy. Reform turned cautious. Surveillance grew. Rebellion, even whispered, was to be smothered before it could draw breath. Pugachev may have lost his head, but he left a warning that haunted Catherine, that power built on inequality can hold for only so long before the storm breaks through. By the time Catherine the Great neared the last years of her life, she had ruled Russia for more than 3 decades, longer than any woman in Russian history. From the moment she took power, she had defied every expectation, remade her empire, and redefined what a woman and a monarch could be. Under her reign, Russia became a genuine European power. Its land grew by more than 200,000 square miles, taking in Crimea, parts of Poland, and stretches of the Black Sea coast. These were not merely military prizes. They were strategic moves, securing warm water ports and reshaping trade. But her legacy was not drawn on maps alone. Catherine left a cultural mark as well. She helped found the Hermitage Museum, gathered one of the finest art collections in Europe, and exchanged letters with the leading minds of the Enlightenment. Her court became a hub of refinement, art, and intellectual ambition. In a country Western Europeans often dismissed as backward, Catherine placed Russia firmly on the cultural map. She modernized education, opened schools for girls, and encouraged the printing of books. She brought smallpox inoculation to Russia, even taking the treatment publicly herself, an act of scientific courage in her day. Yet her reign was also full of contradictions. Though she admired Enlightenment ideals, she never freed the serfs. In fact, she pushed serfdom deeper into Russia's lands. Her reforms, impressive as they were, stayed mostly top-down, meant to polish the empire without truly changing it. Still, Catherine's rule brought stability and ambition. She knew that power was not inherited. It was made, managed, and forever defended. She ruled not by divine right, but by sheer will, political genius, and tireless calculation. She was called many things: a usurper, a tyrant, a reformer, a seductress. But above all, she was effective. When she died in 1796, Russia was richer, larger, and stronger than it had been in centuries. She left a secure throne, an expanded empire, and a legend that would endure for ages. For all her power, expansion, and lasting legacy, Catherine the Great was still, at heart, a woman moving through a man's world and remaking it in her own image. Behind the imperial portraits and royal decrees stood someone keenly aware of how fragile her place was. She was not born Russian. She reached the throne through a coup. She governed an empire that did not want a woman in charge, and yet she did not merely survive, she flourished. Catherine was never willing to be ornamental. She read without pause, wrote without end, and never stopped learning. Her days were demanding. Hours spent reading reports, writing to foreign powers, editing state papers, and steering a court thick with rival factions. She did not simply sit upon the throne. She worked it like a stateswoman born to the task. She was also, in many ways, lonely. She kept courtiers, lovers, and artists close, yet wrote in her memoirs of how few she could truly trust. Her son Paul, whom she distrusted and held away from affairs of state, grew into a man she feared would unravel all her work. Her deepest bond with Grigory Potemkin settled into close friendship, but his death in 1791 left a wound that never wholly healed. Catherine shaped her own image. She grasped the power of story and wielded it better than most rulers of her time. She presented herself as Mother of Russia, enlightened monarch, warrior empress, and lover of the arts. But beneath those roles was a woman who had weathered rejection, betrayal, scandal, and revolt, and kept going. When she died in 1796, she left an empire transformed, but also questions. Could she have done more to end serfdom? Were her Enlightenment ideals worn down by politics? Was she more reformer or ruler? History remembers her by a title she never gave herself, the Great. Not because she was flawless or gentle or just, but because she seized power and wielded it on her own terms, in a time and place where women were granted none. She did not simply wear the crown, she rewrote what it meant to earn one. In the humid depths of the Chiapas jungle in southern Mexico, the ruins of Palenque whisper tales from the ancient Maya world. Towering temples rise above the canopy, their limestone faces worn by time, yet still full of secrets. And in 1994, one of those secrets came to light. A team of Mexican archaeologists, led by Fanny Lopez Jimenez, was surveying Temple 13, a fairly modest pyramid beside the more famous Temple of the Inscriptions, the burial place of the mighty king, Pakal the Great. The throne wasn't expected to reveal much until they noticed something strange. A sealed, hidden chamber lay beneath the structure. No looters had ever reached it. It was untouched. When the archaeologists broke through and lowered themselves down, they found a stone sarcophagus resting in silence, the air thick with the weight of centuries. As they lifted the lid, red dust rose like smoke, a vivid, startling red. The interior was coated in powdered cinnabar, a toxic mercury sulfide the Maya used in ceremony. And lying within that crimson haze was the skeleton of a woman. She had been buried with care and reverence. Her bones were fragile but whole, her skull still wearing a jade mask, her body ringed by offerings, necklaces, diadems, ear spools, all shaped from jade and shell. Everything about the burial spoke of royalty. Yet no name was carved, no glyphs named her. It was one of the richest female burials ever uncovered in Mesoamerica, and yet a complete riddle. Why the red powder? Who was she? A queen? A priestess? Perhaps Pakal's wife? Researchers called her the Red Queen, and the name held. Even with modern forensics, they couldn't say for certain who she was, only that she had lived around the 7th century, during the golden age of Palenque. Unlike most Maya tombs, hers had been concealed, untouched, deliberately set apart. Her burial wasn't only ceremonial, it was spiritual. This woman was not meant to be remembered in words. She was meant to be remembered through ritual, through color, and through the mystery she left behind. The most haunting feature of the Red Queen's tomb wasn't her jade or the silence of the sealed chamber. It was the red dust. A thick layer of powdered cinnabar covered everything, the sarcophagus, the walls, her bones, even the offerings around her. It clung like blood to stone. To the Maya, this was no accident. Cinnabar, made from crushed mercury sulfide, was among the most sacred and dangerous substances of the ancient world. Its brilliant red wasn't merely striking to the eye. It stood for blood, rebirth, and the life force linking the human and divine realms. Red was sacred. It was the color of sunrise, of sacrifice, of life rising out of death. And it wasn't only symbolic, it was spiritual. It was a passage, a crossing into another cosmic layer. And so the Red Queen, whoever she was being prepared not just for burial, but for deification. But there's another layer to this. Cinnabar is toxic. Repeated exposure can bring mercury poisoning, tremors, hallucinations, even death. The Maya likely didn't grasp the chemistry, but they sensed its power. It was volatile, potent, dangerous. To bathe a corpse in it was to declare this person no ordinary mortal. In Palenque, very few were buried with cinnabar. Pakal the Great, the mighty king whose pyramid towers over the site, was one. His body, like hers, was also saturated in the red powder. That detail alone fueled speculation. Was the Red Queen his wife, his mother, or someone of equal divine standing? Her skull had been laid on a layer of jaguar skin, another sacred symbol. Around her, bone needles, obsidian blades, and tiny jade figurines hinted at rituals performed during her life or in her honor at death. Every part of her burial told a story without words, a story of power wrapped in secrecy. A woman prepared to cross into the underworld, not in silence, but in ceremony, drenched in the color of sacrifice. Surrounding the Red Queen's crimson-soaked remains was a world of silence, broken only by the gleam of jade, shell, and obsidian. These were not mere ornaments. They were offerings, each one chosen with care to accompany her on the journey to the Maya afterlife, Xibalba. At her sides lay jade necklaces, heavy and cold, their polished surfaces still glowing after centuries underground. Jade was not only beautiful, it was sacred. The Maya saw it as a symbol of eternal life. It stood for the green of maize, the vitality of the jungle, the breath of the gods. Only the elite were buried with jade. For the Red Queen, it covered her chest, wrists, and ears, a clear sign that in life she held influence, perhaps even divine favor. One of the most haunting objects was the jade funerary mask placed gently over her face. Unlike the golden death masks of Egypt, this one was subtle, built from dozens of tiny mosaic tiles arranged to echo the contours of her skull. The mask served a ritual purpose, to guard the soul, to preserve identity, and to present her as divine in the eyes of the gods. Scattered near her bones were bone needles, obsidian blades, and shell artifacts. These may have been tools of ritual or marks of her status as priestess, healer, or royal matriarch. One bone pin was engraved, faint but deliberate, a small echo of her voice lost to time. At her feet and along the tomb's edges were ceramic vessels, still sealed, once likely filled with offerings. Food, drink, or incense to sustain her spirit beyond death. The Maya believed the afterlife was a journey, dangerous, layered, full of trials. These items weren't luxuries, they were necessities. To us, the tomb feels intimate, not crowded, but intentional. There was no gold, no chariots, no spectacle, only items chosen for their spiritual weight. It was a map for the soul. Through these treasures, we glimpse how the Maya understood death, not as an ending, but as a transfer of power. The Red Queen wasn't buried to be forgotten. She was being prepared to ascend. For all the grandeur of her tomb, the Red Queen left behind one haunting void. No name, no inscriptions marked her sarcophagus. No glyphs on the walls named her. She was clearly someone powerful. But who? From the moment her tomb was opened, scholars began trying to connect the threads. The most compelling theory is that the Red Queen was Tuzakbu-Ajor, the wife of Kinich Janab Pakal, known today as Pakal the Great, the most famous ruler of Palenque. Tuzakbu-Ajor was more than Pakal's consort. She was born into nobility and married into Palenque's royal line at a young age. She bore at least 3 sons, all of high rank, and she played a key ceremonial role during her husband's reign. If anyone could be buried with such honor, it was her. Supporting this theory was the tomb's location, only a few feet from Pakal's own grand burial in the Temple of the Inscriptions. The closeness suggests a deliberate pairing, husband and wife, rulers even in death. And then there's the cinnabar. Only 2 burials in Palenque were found with such intense coverage, Pakal and the Red Queen. It's unlikely that was coincidence. But here the mystery deepens. DNA tests were run on both sets of remains, hoping to confirm the link. The results were inconclusive. The woman's bones showed no direct maternal tie to Pakal. But that didn't rule out a marriage. After all, marriage requires no shared blood. Some have argued she could have been Sakkuk, Pakal's powerful mother who ruled Palenque before he came of age. Others suggest she may have been a high priestess, or a sister, or a royal ancestor whose name has simply worn away with time. Still, the evidence points most strongly to Sakbu-Ajor, a queen by title, a mother of kings, and a spiritual counterpart to Pakal. The lack of a name may not have been a mistake. It might have been a choice. In Maya belief, the soul endured not through monuments, but through ritual, symbol, and the quiet murmurs of the earth. And so the Red Queen lingers between myth and fact. A woman who governed, recalled not in stone, but in crimson and stillness. To know the Red Queen, we must know the world that shaped her. A world in which Maya women, especially those of royal blood, carried more sway than many imagine. In Maya society, politics was often a matter of kinship. Royal women were never simply quiet companions. They were diplomats, priestesses, and brokers of power. They led rituals, funded temples, and helped uphold the legitimacy of dynasties. Their lineages were political currency, used to bind alliances and strengthen claims to the throne. Consider Sakkuk, the mother of Pakal the Great. When Palenque's throne sat empty, she seized power herself and ruled as regent until her son was old enough. She was no mere stand-in. She governed in her own right, issuing orders and directing building works. Without her, Pakal might never have risen at all, and she was not unique. Throughout the Maya region, in cities like Yaxchilan, Naranjo, and Calakmul, carvings reveal women leading great ceremonies, taking part in warfare and diplomacy, and at times ruling on their own. They appear on stelae and murals, adorned in elaborate headdresses and finery, standing alongside kings as equals or even above them. Their words were cut into glyphs. Their names were honored until they no longer were. By the time Spanish conquistadors arrived centuries afterward, much of that memory had faded. The colonial gaze saw native women as silent figures in a man's world. But the archaeology says otherwise, telling of intricate gender roles where power was negotiated, not merely passed down. This backdrop reframes the Red Queen. She may not have ruled by name, but her burial, rich, sacred, and set beside Pakal, suggests she was a central pillar of the royal order. Her jade mask was no mere ornament. It was a token of identity, of power held in life and guarded in death. Her bloodline may have been the very bond that kept Palenque's dynasty whole. In Maya civilization, a queen was far more than a queen. She was a guardian of sacred lineage, a voice in ceremony, and often the bridge between gods and men. The Red Queen may be nameless, but in her world she was never without a voice. The Red Queen wasn't only buried with treasures, she was buried within architecture full of purpose, layered with Maya cosmology, ritual symbolism, and deliberate design. Her tomb wasn't merely a grave. It was a doorway to eternity. Her body was found inside Temple 13, one of the smaller pyramids at the heart of Palenque. Yet its nearness to the Temple of the Inscriptions, where Pakal the Great rests, is revealing. These temples weren't placed at random. Their arrangement was sacred, shaped by astronomy, myth, and dynasty. Temple 13 rises modestly beside its grander neighbor, but it conceals something more intimate, a sealed crypt untouched by looters, perfectly preserved. It was built deep within the temple's core, reached only by a steep, narrow stair. The descent into her tomb feels almost symbolic, a ritual journey downward into the underworld. The chamber itself is plain, made of cut stone, sealed tight for over 1,300 years. No glyphs or murals line the walls. No ornate carvings recount her story. But perhaps that silence is deliberate. This was a space not for the living to read, but for the dead to be transformed. At its center, her sarcophagus rests like an altar shaped from limestone. It mirrors the great stone coffin of Pakal next door. While Pakal's lid is famously carved with scenes of cosmic rebirth, the Red Queen's tomb is quieter. The focus turns inward, to the body, to the cinnabar, to the ritual of death itself. And yet, there are subtle architectural hints of meaning. The tomb is aligned east to west, a symbolic path echoing the sun's journey from life to death. The chamber is small but potent. It feels intentional, personal, a sacred enclosure for someone revered. Maya temples were cosmological instruments, bridges between the heavens, the earth, and the underworld. To be buried in one was to be raised beyond the human realm. The Red Queen's eternal home wasn't an afterthought. It was a carefully built shrine, a place where death became transformation. Her bones rest in stone, her essence in cinnabar, and her legacy in the architecture itself. A temple that speaks without words, telling us she mattered. To the ancient Maya, death wasn't the end. It was a threshold, a sacred passage into the underworld known as Xibalba. And for someone like the Red Queen, this crossing was not only spiritual, it was political, cosmological, and deeply ritualized. Burial rites were carefully arranged events rooted in myth, meant to guide the soul through the perilous layers of the underworld. Maya texts and imagery tell us Xibalba was no peaceful afterlife. It was a maze of darkness, rivers of blood, trials, and gods of death. Only those properly buried, ritually prepared, and spiritually equipped could complete the journey. The Red Queen was buried, wrapped in cinnabar, sealed in stone and surrounded by offerings, all marks of an elite burial. But there's more. The presence of bone needles and obsidian blades in her tomb hints at bloodletting rituals. Perhaps symbolic tools standing for rites she had performed in life, or that were reenacted at her burial to strengthen her spirit. Her mask, carefully pieced together from jade tiles, was not merely decorative. It may have served as a spiritual vessel, preserving her face and identity as she traveled into the afterlife. In Maya belief, the face was a mirror of the soul, and the soul needed to be recognized by the gods. The ceramic vessels around her may once have held chocolate, maize, water, or even pulque to feed her in the next world. Other objects, like stingray spines or shell trumpets, could have stood for spiritual tools, calls to the gods, or tokens of ritual communication. Burial wasn't simply a farewell. It was a transformation. The Maya believed in cycles, death as seed, burial as planting, and the afterlife as rebirth. Kings and queens were often seen as earthly incarnations of gods, and in death they returned to those origins. The Red Queen, draped in the colour of blood, entombed in a pyramid and honoured with offerings, was being readied for rebirth, not as a mortal, but as a being bound to the sacred order of the cosmos. Her burial wasn't the end of her story, it was the start of her legend. Only a few steps from the Red Queen's final resting place lies one of the most iconic tombs in Mesoamerica, that of Kinich Janab Pakal, known simply as Pakal the Great. His burial within the Grand Temple of the Inscriptions is famed for its artistry, scale, and deeply spiritual meaning. But what makes the Red Queen's tomb so remarkable is not only what lay inside, it's where it was found. Her sarcophagus was hidden within Temple 13, directly beside Pakal's monument. In a city like Palenque, where every temple was carefully placed to reflect cosmic principles, this nearness was no accident. It was deliberate, a statement set in stone. Many scholars believe the Red Queen was Zakbu Ajal, Pakal's queen and trusted consort. Though her tomb bears no inscriptions, the parallels between their burials are striking. Both wrapped in cinnabar, both entombed in pyramids, both buried with jade, and both treated with deep reverence. She lies wrapped in red, the colour of life and sacrifice, of blood and rebirth. Her face, once hidden behind a jade mask, now stares back at us through science, art, and wonder. She remains nameless, but not a mystery, forgotten by no one. The Red Queen may have ruled a kingdom in life, but in death she rules something greater, our imagination. Her tomb was sealed in stone. Her story was written in silence. And still, somehow, she speaks. These two burials echo one another, as though they were two halves of a single sacred whole. The carved lid above Pakal famously shows him descending into the underworld tree, a cosmic image of dying and being reborn. The Red Queen's plainer tomb carries no such carvings, yet the meaning rests in the pairing itself. If Pakal stood for the sun, travelling through the underworld at night only to rise again, then the Red Queen may have stood for the moon, the feminine power that follows its own quiet path across the sky. Together, they formed a cosmic balance. Masculine and feminine, king and queen, sun and moon, order and ceremony. For the Maya, to rule was never a solitary thing. It was a relationship. Cosmic harmony demanded balance, and that balance reached into the royal court itself. By laying the Red Queen beside Pakal, the Maya were safeguarding not only a marriage, but a partnership written across the heavens. Their nearness in death may have echoed their roles in life. A queen not behind, but beside her king, sharing not merely a throne, but a legacy. Within their tombs they speak without speaking. Two souls wrapped in cinnabar and stone, bound together across eternity. One of history's most sacred silences. Though her name slipped away with time, the Red Queen of Palenque survives not as a forgotten relic, but as one of the most mysterious and powerful women of the ancient world. Her tomb, closed for more than 1,300 years, now murmurs across the centuries, raising questions that grow louder with every new discovery. She is a mystery that still refuses to be solved. We may never know exactly who she was. No glyph spelled out her name. No carved stone recorded her story. And yet the tenderness of her burial, the wealth of her offerings, the meaning behind her crimson-soaked bones, all speak of a woman deeply important, not merely as a wife or consort, but as someone who held genuine influence, spiritual weight, and royal blood. Today the Red Queen pushes us to rethink our assumptions. She reminds us that in the ancient Maya world, women were not silent. They led rituals, ruled cities, and shaped dynasties. While kings like Pakal have long held the spotlight, the Red Queen's return reminds us that power did not belong to men alone. It moved through mothers, queens, priestesses, and visionaries. Her legacy is far more than the treasures she left behind. It is the conversation she has sparked among archaeologists, historians, artists, and storytellers. Every jade bead, every layer of cinnabar, every choice made in building her temple tells us something deliberate. Not what we know, but what we still do not. The Red Queen teaches us that history is not only a gathering of facts, it is a living puzzle, a shared human wish to reach back and touch the past. In that way, her legacy is still unfolding. She lies wrapped in red, the colour of life and sacrifice, of blood and rebirth. Her face, once concealed behind a jade mask, now gazes back at us through science, art, and wonder. She stays nameless, yet not mysterious, yet not forgotten. The Red Queen may have ruled a kingdom in life, but in death she rules something greater, our imagination. Her tomb was sealed in stone, her story was written in silence, and still, somehow, she speaks. Frida Kahlo was born on July 6, 1907, in the lively district of Coyoacán, then a village on the edge of Mexico City. Her childhood home, the Casa Azul, the Blue House, was full of colour, contradiction, and quiet strength. It would later become a refuge, a battleground, and a museum devoted to one of the most iconic artists of the 20th century. Frida was the third of four daughters born to Guillermo Kahlo, a German-Hungarian photographer, and Matilda Calderón, a devout Catholic of indigenous and Spanish descent. Her parents were opposites. Guillermo, reserved and intellectual. Matilda, religious and emotionally distant. Frida would inherit her father's introspection and artistic eye, but also her mother's fierce will. As a child, Frida was imaginative, outspoken, and bold. She read endlessly and asked the kinds of questions most adults preferred to avoid. But at the age of 6, she caught polio, which left her right leg thinner and weaker than the other, a difference she tried to hide beneath long skirts but never let limit her spirit. The illness kept her bedridden for months and cut off from other children. During that time, she grew close to her father, who urged her to exercise, ride bicycles, and keep her mind sharp. Unlike most girls of her era, Frida did not dream of becoming a wife or a homemaker. Her aim was to become a doctor. She enrolled in the prestigious National Preparatory School in Mexico City at 15, one of only a handful of girls admitted. There she stood out, not only for her intelligence but for her rebellious wit, radical thinking, and singular sense of style. She joined a circle of young intellectuals known as the Cachuchas, who argued over philosophy, literature, and politics. Frida was drawn to revolution, to ideas that challenged tradition. Yet even in those early years, before the bus crash that would define her body, and before the fame that would define her legacy, Frida Kahlo was already painting herself into the world with sharp edges, unapologetic ideas, and an identity too large to fit inside anyone else's expectations. She was not simply growing up in Coyoacán, she was preparing to remake herself entirely. On September 17, 1925, Frida Kahlo's life was split in two: the girl she had been and the woman she was forced to become. That afternoon she boarded a wooden bus with her boyfriend, Alejandro Gomez Arias, after school. They were laughing, teasing each other, and probably arguing. Frida never did anything halfway. But moments later the bus collided with a streetcar, and in an instant her future unraveled into pain, metal, and silence. The crash was horrific. The streetcar crushed the bus against a wall, splintering wood and flinging passengers. Frida was impaled by an iron handrail. It entered her left hip and exited through her pelvis. Her spine fractured in 3 places, her right leg shattered, her foot dislocated, her collarbone and ribs broke, her shoulder was dislocated, her abdomen was pierced. She was only 18 years old. A man covered her with his coat. Someone else noticed that her body was sparkling, not from blood, but from the gold powder she had been carrying in a pouch. It had burst on impact, dusting her broken form in what looked like glittering ash. Frida was taken to the Red Cross hospital and underwent many surgeries over the following months. She spent weeks in a body cast, flat on her back, unable to move, racked with infection and uncertainty. The future she had imagined, of becoming a doctor, slipped further away with every passing day. But in that stillness, something began to stir. Her father gave her brushes. Her mother rigged a special easel to hang above her bed. A mirror was placed on the canopy so she could see herself. And there, lying in plaster and agony, Frida began to paint. First out of boredom, then out of obsession. Her earliest subjects were her own reflection, because she was all she had. But what emerged was not vanity. It was survival. The crash had broken her body, but it had also opened a door into her own mind, her own body, and eventually into the surreal language of pain and identity that would define her art. The girl who had wanted to heal others now began healing herself, one brushstroke at a time. As Frida Kahlo lay encased in plaster and steel, a body fighting itself with every breath, she began to paint. What started as a kind of therapy soon turned into a language all its own. Her earliest subjects were self-portraits, not out of vanity, but because, as she once said, "I paint myself because I am so often alone, and because I am the subject I know best." Her early pieces were small, made on tin or wood panels inspired by Mexican retablos, devotional paintings meant to. And that language was intensely personal, painfully honest, and frequently difficult to look at, which was exactly the intention. Frida did not paint cheerful flowers or tidy landscapes. She painted pain, her own pain, physical, emotional, and existential, record suffering and miracles. Frida turned this tradition inward. Her body became the canvas, her feelings became the altar. She painted herself split open, pierced, bleeding. In one work she is impaled by nails like a modern martyr. In another, she drifts through an empty landscape tied to a broken column, a symbol for her shattered spine. She painted herself weeping, cracked, beheaded, and bare, yet never passive, always watching. Her pain was never softened. She rendered the ugliness of trauma with beauty, defiance, and even humour. Each piece reclaimed her body, her experience, and her identity as a woman in a world that so often tried to define her. But Frida wasn't only telling her story. She was creating a new kind of visual narrative, one blending Mexican folk art, surrealism, medical illustration, and symbolism. Her paintings became dreamlike autopsies of her soul, framed in colour, culture, and myth. By the time she could walk again, though painfully, Frida was no longer the girl who had hoped to be a doctor. She was an artist, and her art resembled nothing anyone had seen. She had taken the worst thing that ever happened to her and made it a source of creation. Frida Kahlo didn't simply paint her pain. She made the world look at it, and in doing so she turned suffering into a sacred act of self-expression. In 1928, still healing, still painting, and only 21 years old, Frida Kahlo met the man who would become the deepest and most turbulent relationship of her life, Diego Rivera. He was 20 years older, already Mexico's most celebrated painter. She carried her paintings to him at the Ministry of Education, interrupting his work on the scaffold to ask plainly, "Do I have talent?" Diego took one look and said, "Yes, and not just to be kind." He saw in her something rare, an unfiltered voice, raw and unpretentious, full of rage, irony, pain. Enormous in both size and presence, Rivera was a giant of Mexican muralism, known for his sweeping, politically charged frescoes that told the story of the Mexican people. Frida had seen his work before. She admired it, but now she wanted his judgment of her own. And beauty. They began a relationship as consuming as it was creative. Frida once said, "I suffered 2 accidents in my life, one in which a streetcar knocked me down. The other was Diego." They married in 1929. To outsiders, an odd pairing. Diego, huge, unfaithful, politically famous. Frida, sharp-tongued, fiercely independent, already walking with a cane. Her parents called it a marriage between an elephant and a dove. Their bond was passionate but chaotic. Diego supported her art and encouraged her growth as a painter. Yet he was also endlessly unfaithful, even with Frida's own sister, Cristina. Frida was devastated, and in return she took lovers of her own, both men and women, including rumoured affairs with Leon Trotsky and the painter Georgia O'Keeffe. They divorced in 1939, then remarried a year later under different terms. This time, Frida would keep her independence, her home, her money, her name. Their second marriage was less about traditional love and more about creative partnership and mutual understanding. Despite the betrayals and the heartbreak, Diego remained a constant force in Frida's life. He challenged her. He wounded her, but he also believed in her as an artist, as a revolutionary, and as a woman who could reshape what painting could be. Together they were not peaceful, but they were legendary. In the 1930s, Frida Kahlo followed Diego Rivera north to San Francisco, Detroit, and New York as he completed high-profile mural commissions. These years abroad brought her face to face with American industrialism, wealth, and the contradictions of capitalism, and they left her with deep political unease. Frida was a proud Mexican nationalist, a committed communist, and an admirer of indigenous traditions. The opulence she saw in the United States, especially while the Great Depression battered much of the country, only deepened her disillusionment. In letters home, she mocked the culture's materialism and obsession with appearances. She missed the grit, color, and contradiction of Mexico. While Diego painted vast murals on factory walls, Frida began painting smaller, quieter revolutions, deeply personal works on tin and canvas. Her style hardened, sharp, surreal, emotional, and intimate. It was during this time that she produced some of her most striking self-portraits. Frida didn't paint herself for vanity. She painted herself to survive. Her identity became her landscape. With her body in constant pain from her accident, multiple surgeries, and a failed pregnancy in Detroit, she turned inward. Her portraits showed her bleeding, fragmented, exposed. Yet her face was always calm, always unapologetic. One of her most powerful works, Henry Ford Hospital, shows her lying on a hospital bed, weeping, surrounded by floating symbols of loss. A fetus, a snail, medical equipment, a cracked pelvis. It was raw, graphic, and deeply emotional. A canvas that bled truth. Back in Mexico, Frida threw herself into leftist politics. She and Diego welcomed Leon Trotsky into their home while he lived in exile. Frida wore Tehuana dresses, traditional indigenous garments, not just as fashion, but as a political and cultural statement. Her art was never separate from her beliefs. Her identity, her body, and her ideology all wove together in her work. While Rivera painted murals of revolution, Frida painted its human cost. The body in pieces, the mind on fire, and the self always staring back. In exile and in illness, she became not only a painter of pain, but a painter of resistance. When Frida Kahlo returned to Mexico in the late 1930s, she was no longer simply Diego Rivera's wife. She had become something else entirely, a force, an artist whose work radiated raw honesty, surreal symbolism, and cultural identity. Back in her homeland, she stepped fully into herself. Her Casa Azul in Coyoacan became a sanctuary of color and contradiction. Bright cobalt walls, yellow trim, Aztec statues in the garden, monkeys and parrots wandering freely. The house was a living extension of Frida's imagination. It was a blend of tradition and rebellion, elegance and earth. Here she surrounded herself with pre-Columbian artifacts, ex-votos, folk art, and revolutionary books. She wore bold Tehuana dresses, wove flowers into her hair, and painted amid the scent of copal incense and the sound of mariachi on the street outside. This period marked an explosion of creativity. Her paintings grew more intricate, more symbolic, and more political. Works like the two Fridas revealed a divided self, one in European dress with a bleeding heart, the other in indigenous clothing, strong and composed. It was Frida's visual autobiography, a portrait of love, loss, and heritage. In 1939, she exhibited her work in Paris, where artists like Picasso, Breton, and Kandinsky praised her fiercely original style. But even among the surrealists, Frida stood apart. When André Breton tried to claim her as one of their own, she pushed back. "They thought I was a surrealist," she once remarked. "But I wasn't. I never painted my dreams. I painted my own reality." She painted Mexico, not the pretty postcard version, but the living, breathing land she loved. Her work brimmed with symbols. Skeletons, hummingbirds, hearts, thorns, corn, and blood. She honored the indigenous roots of her country while laying bare the violence of its past and its present. Yet even as her artistic voice grew bolder, her health kept slipping away. Repeated surgeries, infections, and lasting pain became her everyday companions. Still, she painted through it, propped up in bed, her torso laced into corsets, her fingers curled around the brush. Frida had come home to Mexico not to rest, but to take back her strength through paint, through politics, and through her fearless embrace of who she was. As the 1940s went on, Frida Kahlo's body kept failing her. Her spine was crumbling. Her right leg stayed infected. She endured more than 30 surgeries over her lifetime, often one after another. There were times she lay in bed for months, sealed in body casts or held still by devices that pulled her bones apart. But she painted on. Each canvas from these years was both a release and an act of defiance. Her pictures turned darker, more unyielding. She painted with a sharpness honed by pain, no longer softening the metaphor. In the broken column, she shows herself split down the middle, her body studded with nails, a cracked stone column standing in for her spine. Yet her face is calm, her gaze steady. Pain, for Frida, was no longer only a subject. It was her companion, her enemy, her muse. Her political voice rose louder too. She joined the Mexican Communist Party, marched in demonstrations, wrote burning letters, and condemned imperialism and injustice. When her health no longer let her walk, she came to protests in a wheelchair, stubbornly raising signs and calling out slogans. In 1953, Frida was given her first solo show in Mexico, a recognition long overdue. But her health was so frail that her doctors said she could not attend. So she did the only thing Frida would do. She arrived by ambulance, carried in on a stretcher, and set in the heart of the gallery on her own hospital bed. Dressed in traditional finery, surrounded by her paintings, she welcomed her guests with tequila, laughter, and that fire still alive in her eyes. Her last paintings were at once childlike and haunting. In Marxism will give health to the sick. She painted herself in a steel corset, held in the hands of Marx, casting away the symbols of oppression. Her final known work was a still life of sliced watermelons, one piece carrying the words, "Viva la vida," long live life. Even facing death, she stayed defiant, joyful, and political. Frida Kahlo's last portraits were not only self-portraits. They were acts of revolution, painted in pain, but always signed with life. On July 13th, 1954, at the age of 47, Frida Kahlo died in the very place she had been born, La Casa Azul. The cause was officially listed as a pulmonary embolism, but those nearest to her hinted at something deeper. She had been ill, yes, but also worn out by pain, by surgeries, by the long war with her own body. Only days earlier, she had joined a protest against the CIA-backed coup in Guatemala. Weak and bound to her wheelchair, she insisted on going, her fist clenched in the air. Revolution stayed her final heartbeat. Her last diary line was short but cutting. "I hope the exit is joyful, and I hope never to return." Frida's funeral was held at the Palacio de Bellas Artes, Mexico's most honored cultural institution. Her body, wrapped in the red flag of the Mexican Communist Party, was watched over by friends, family, artists, and revolutionaries. Diego Rivera was beside himself. He called her the greatest love of his life, even though his betrayals had nearly shattered her. But in the years after her death, something remarkable unfolded. Frida Kahlo refused to fade. At first, her name was spoken only in art circles. Her work was hard to classify, too political for the surrealists, too surreal for the traditionalists. Yet slowly her image, her story, and her defiance began to take hold. Through the 1970s and 1980s, as feminist scholars and activists recovered forgotten voices, Frida's grew stronger. She was no longer just a painter. She was a symbol of pain turned into beauty, of feminism born from resistance, of Mexican identity celebrated without apology, of queerness, disability, revolution, and authenticity. Her face, the brow, the gaze, the flowers in her hair became iconic. Her home became a museum. Her diary became a sacred text. And her paintings now hang in the world's greatest museums. Frida Kahlo had spent much of her life in Diego's shadow. But in death, she stepped forward. She did not only leave behind paintings, she left behind a mirror and dared us all to look. Not with pity, not with fear, but with fire. Today, Frida Kahlo's face is everywhere, printed on t-shirts, painted on murals, made into dolls, memes, posters and icons. Her signature brow, her flower-crowned hair, her steady gaze, all instantly known. But what makes her legacy so strong isn't only that people know her face, it's that they recognize the truth behind it. Frida never tried to be flawless. She didn't fit into boxes. She wasn't conventional, and she had no wish to be. In a world that demands perfection, she gave us realness. Raw, messy, vibrant, angry, joyful realness. She celebrated what set her apart, her disability, her queerness, her politics, her culture, and turned it into art that crossed borders and decades. She has become more than an artist. She is a global symbol of defiance, feminism, cultural pride, and resistance. For queer communities, she is a fearless bisexual icon who lived openly in a time that demanded silence. For women, she is a reminder that power needs no permission. For disabled artists, she is proof that pain can feed the brush rather than stop it. And for Mexico, she is a daughter reclaimed, fierce, folkloric, and forever part of the national soul. Her paintings, once brushed aside as too strange or too personal, now rank among the most revered in the world. Works like the two Fridas, self-portrait with thorn necklace and hummingbird, and the broken column aren't simply seen. They're felt deeply by anyone who has ever suffered and needed to turn that suffering into something sacred. She lived in the margins and made them center stage. She embraced contradiction, a communist who wore gold, a woman betrayed who loved again, a body in pieces with a soul still whole. And through it all, she painted, not only with color, but with conviction. Frida Kahlo never asked to be a symbol. She simply told the truth about herself. And in doing so, she told the truth for millions of others who had never seen themselves reflected in art. Now, when we see her face, we see courage, we see color, we see resistance. We see Frida, not gone, but here still, resting softly in the colors she left behind. And so we let her story settle into the quiet, and let ourselves drift gently into sleep.